Ultimately, it's a tricky concept to explain, and few people will be willing to sit through the explanation with the level of understanding needed to see why Exodus 21, verse 20 to 21, doesn't tell you that it's okay to beat your slaves. The passage in Exodus 21, talking about a slave and his master, is a controversial one, especially since it appears to give the slave owner permission to beat his slave. However, this is seen from the perspective of people always on the side of the slaves, and will always see any slave owner as a harsh, brutal bully. Whilst there's no denying there were such slave owners, especially in the Americas, there is more to the action than simple brute force and sadism. Interestingly enough, the answer is something that goes completely over the head of many people in this capitalist world we live in. With this in mind, I propose to lead you through a thought experiment that should not only explain the passage in Exodus 21, but also give an explanation into the mindset of the slave owners whom God is trying to convince to treat their slaves better, and ultimately to remove slavery entirely. First port of order is to understand the benefits of slavery and why it was so popular across history. It seems the main reason is a cheap source of labour, since slaves, by common understanding, do not get any money for their work. However, that does not mean they are entirely free to own. If you own any form of livestock, you need to feed them, water them, provide living quarters, and give them medications to keep them living long enough to do the work. Whilst on the surface, that sounds like it would be too much to bother about in terms of ownership, as with anything, you can buy in bulk or use the same thing all for one, or one for all. For example, one building to house them all, one cheap source of food and water, and only as many medications as required to keep them alive. This is far easier to do with a controlled population of owned slaves that you keep in or around your property than it is to give the necessary payments to people who work for you and have to pay those things themselves. So, with that in mind, I've prepared a very rough list of numbers. You should be able to find them in the description. That will help us go through this interesting quandary of slave economy. Let's do some very simple maths. Let's say a slave costs around 40,000 to buy. One slave, £40,000. That is high compared to modern slavery, but we're working with a very simple budgeting technique here. Let's assume that we're trying to fit as many slaves as possible into one place. So let's just go purely practical, use a barn which is about 200 metres square. That's going to cost around £25,000. They can fit around 60 people in there, but if you use bunk beds, that is going to double the amount of people who will sleep there. So let's just say 120 slaves, that's going to cost around £7,500 to get enough bunk beds for them. We could go for free, but that's going to be interesting enough as it is. Feeding them is rather simple and only costs around £500 per meal if we go for something very simple like soup, hash or stew, maybe with a simple cup of water. And if we assume that they're only getting 2 meals a day, that's about £1,000 a day just to feed them. A monthly once-over by the doctor to make sure there's nothing amiss. That's going to be interesting considering that in those days or in those regions where slavery would have been popular, the the healthcare system would not be free. So that's going to be around $300 a month if we're going very basic, but that's going to be for 1 day visit, no complications and no treatment. It's going to be a lot more if treatment is required. So, to sum that up, upfront costs of the slaves and the accommodation is at most 4.83 million. Running costs will be, just for their food and doctor's bills, will be about 31,300. So that's all the costs, expenses. What about the income? Well, if we go for the most profitable one, which was cotton, each slave would have been expected to pick around £200 of cotton per day. Cotton cost about 20 pence per pound, so that's about £40 per slave per day. If you have 120 slaves, that's around £4,800 a day, and over the month, that's 148,800 a month, making a monthly profit, just based off the doctor's bills and food alone, of 117,500. At that rate, your upfront costs will take around 3.5 years to clear, assuming you're not in debt and don't have any interest accumulating. Sounds steep, but compare that to the current minimum wage of £1.60 at a standard 8-hour working day, making £70 per worker, 6-day week, making around £420, and the same size workforce, that is £201,600 per month. In short, you're making a loss if you pay people something not even considered a living wage, if you expect them to work the same amount. Slavery, it seems, does pay, and in fact seems to benefit people more. I'll be honest here, all this is based on high-end numbers which I found online using broad average of slave ownership, since 120 would be sort of at the high end of it, and most plantations would have only 5 or 6 slaves. Punch them into a calculator, and some others will give much better margins, and we're completely missing the costs of running a farm itself. But that is way beyond my understanding of prices, and therefore I can't go full 100% accurate. I'm going to hold my hands up for that. But just based on these rough numbers alone, you can see why slavery was so popular in history. So if God is someone who values human prosperity, as I often say he is, why am I saying he doesn't want us to have slaves? Well, many human rights people will say it's all down to the fact that treating people as slaves in the manner I've mentioned in a previous video is demeaning for your fellow man. You may want to check out that video, but the basics of it is it doesn't take long for a slave doing seemingly menial work to be looked down on by the owners and their descendants, and thus the abuse and ridicule of the slaves comes around. The gradual decline of that gradually rolls into abuse, and any sort of abuse causes mental health to decline. This is notable no matter where it happens, be it in the home, relationships, workplace, school or church. This effect on mental health will naturally lead to a decline in productivity. Unfortunately, the way slavers deal with slaves that don't work as hard is to beat them, which can lead to injuries, which would make working more painful, much harder, and thus reduce productivity even further. Now, they could get rid of a slave and hope to get a better one, but that's going to be much difficult especially if you have a reputation for returning slaves in a sorry state. It doesn't look good. It shows that you have a temper, which isn't good for business. Yes, you could, of course, get more slaves, but that's more upfront costs, more food to buy, more doctors' bills, more accommodation to get, and sooner or later it becomes less productive to keep slaves. In fact, I'm pretty sure the drop in the prices of cotton were a result of slaves being so productive in supply. But what if you were to accidentally kill a slave during a beating and, say, pass it off as an accident in the fields, a fight, or just claim they ran away? That means your reputation is safe. You can get another slave to replace it without having to increase your monthly overheads. Yes, you'll have to work 3.5 years to gain back your cost of buying them, but that is nothing to worry about. It's something you'll do, and well, you know that this slave will last longer, and you've got a better chance of picking out the right one. Unfortunately, this is how it would have been during the prime time of slavery, and odds are would have been exactly the same in Old Testament times. This is a complete disregard of human life for the sake of profit. However, what if a punishment was brought in so if you kill your slave, you lose more than if you had to nurse them back to health, which in of itself is fairly expensive. Exodus 21 verse 20 doesn't explain what the punishment is, though if earlier verses are to be judged, it is likely to be the slaver being put to death, with later verses pointing out if you disable your slave, they will go free. This actively puts a deterrent on beating your slave, especially if you have to nurse them back to working health, without getting any profit from their working. I've run the calculations. You could lose more in nursing a slave back to health than if you just paid someone a minimum wage. Many people might say, why bother making these rules that discourage the beating of slaves? But you can just say, no more slaves and don't hit them. The simple fact is, this doesn't solve the problem, but more likely creates a new one. It renders the economy inactive and stalls the civilization. Instead of destroying an economy, it's better to introduce reforms which alters the perspectives of people towards the active component of the economy. They're no longer expendable assets, but people one has to care for and keep strong. This will potentially introduce the first wages and thus remove slavery from the population. Whilst George R.R. Martin's comments of J.R.R. Tolkien and his world, specifically mentioning the Gondorian economy under King Elessar, is understandable. The idea of a good ruler and leader making a kingdom prosperous isn't a fallacy, isn't a fanciful thing. If a good employer is there, people will happily put in the work and more, whilst a bad and cruel lord wouldn't instill such loyalty, and will likely get the quota at best, if they are lucky. This is a common theme in workplace stories across the internet, with good bosses retiring and giving the job to their nepotism hired children, who ruins morale and productivity tanks. And it doesn't have to be just the boss, it can even be the line manager. You come in, you happen to like your previous line manager or happen to like your boss, so you stick with it, but the line manager is just terrible, so you do the bare minimum for them, but do everything you can for your job. This may be a long-winded way of looking at it, But when you consider the passage in Exodus is aimed at the slave owners, the context is hard to grasp for people who don't own actively working assets. Those who work with racehorses, working animals, or dogs, for example, might have a better idea, because if you injure one of the animals, they can't run, they can't work, they can't do what they're meant to do. The vet bills will be sky high, and you'll lose time in training them again. This is something analogous, you will, to the taxi industry, which is what I'm in. If you don't take care of your vehicle, it will likely break down, mechanical costs will go through the roof, and if ultimately you have to stop using that vehicle and sell it on, or get rid of it, scrap it, you're going to be struggling to find a vehicle that will be just as good, within a reasonable budget. Then you have to tax it as a taxi, you have to license it as a taxi, you have to get the right insurance as a taxi, and then you have to put the stickers on and then give it to your employees and hope to God they will actually look after it again. Ultimately, it's the trickiest concept to explain, and a few people will be willing to sit through the explanation with the level of understanding needed to see why Exodus 21, verse 20 to 21, doesn't tell you that it's okay to beat your slaves. It just doesn't. When you look at the numbers and see what the passage says in that light, it's very much a warning to the slave owners that beating your slaves is not encouraged at all. I'll admit I'm not very good with spreadsheets and so forth, but my basic budgeting system has worked well enough for this. It's good for my partner and I, and whilst also being useful to demonstrate this point. If you think differently, by all means, run the numbers. All the links are in the description, and I put a small note file with the costs that I've been working with, just to show you what it is. Hopefully, if you got any ideas how this would be even more detrimental to Christianity, by all means, present it. But I recommend going with the numbers. It's just far simpler, otherwise you're just not looking at it from the perspective of the people who would have been receiving it. Since this is a finance video, I think I may as well leave you with a very bad joke. Religion is definitely better than atheism. Religion not only brings donations, boosts morale, and lets us find enjoyment in many things, but it also pays the bills. On the other hand, by definition, atheism doesn't make the economy grow, because it's a non-profit organisation. Stay humble, stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.